we're going to be talking about clinical trials, of course. And I'm just curious, out of the audience here, a show of hands, who has participated in a clinical trial? Okay, good number. That's great. That's great. You can't hear me? On and off. Oh, I think mine's on. Okay, how's that? So one of the things that has come up a lot for us at CRI is a statistic that many of you may be familiar with already, that only 3 to 6% of eligible cancer patients ever participate in a clinical trial. And as you've heard today, clinical trials can be a really important way to access the latest care and get access to these incredible new treatments. So one of the reasons that we've talked about kind of with a lot of people on this panel is why that number is so low. And the answer that keeps coming back is education and awareness. So that's a big part of why clinical trials are such a big focus today. So I want to kick things off with just get some basics down on clinical trials and start with Dr. Reardon. So in one sentence, what is the aim of a clinical trial?
The aim of a clinical trial is to investigate a new or innovative treatment strategy.
And who would be a candidate for a clinical trial?
Clinical trials, as I mentioned earlier, tend to be very defined in the patient population they're trying to answer the question the trial is designed to answer. There are different levels of trials. There are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and even a phase 0 trial. The higher the number typically refers to a drug that's further along in its testing and evaluation, and that usually means the trial is going to be more and more specific for a select group of patients to answer a very defined question. The phase 1 trials tend to be a little broader, and more patients would probably be eligible to participate, but to find the more advanced trials would be more specific.
Okay, great. So we have a little bit of basic knowledge there, and I just want to have each of our panel members quickly talk about their personal experience with clinical trials. In some cases, you know, it's being a participant, in other cases being a healthcare provider. So my own experiences, I participated in an immunotherapy clinical trial for breast cancer. And Kaylin, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, I've taken part in 3 clinical trials. I'm an ovarian cancer survivor. I was diagnosed on my birthday at the age of 56. I had surgery 3 days later. My choice to find an oncologist, surgeon that would act quickly. Had the traditional rounds of chemotherapy and went to see my physician and was told I was in remission. And I'm like, okay, I'm done. That's good. I'm on. And a little unbeknownst to me, and you'll hear this because she's on another panel, our daughter had done much of that advocate research and had found that ovarian cancer most often reoccurs, and that clinical trials and immunotherapy were the way of the future. And so I enrolled in my first clinical trial, which is not that easy. There were what I call hoops to jump through, many qualifications, blood tests, doctor's visits. All the time, though, I felt very nurtured and comforted and monitored, so to speak, because they were continuing to check me and make sure that I was in remission, because the first clinical trial I started was one that required that. And from then on, I was what I call a clinical trials girl. And I feel like I'm sitting here today, 8 years later, because of immunotherapy and those trials on top of my initial treatment.
Crystal.
Well, my name is Crystal, and I have been working in research for 8 years. My first role in research was a research nurse coordinator. So that's working along with maybe your treating investigator to help coordinate your visits, and kind of like you said, monitor you on the study. My next role was manager of a research division in GYN oncology. And right now, I'm what they call clinical research associate, which means I work with a particular pharmaceutical company, in my case, to help monitor the clinical trials that are being conducted at institutions across the U.S.
Dr. Reardon? Oh. TJ?
Sure, TJ.
Hi, TJ Sharp. I am a stage 4 melanoma survivor. I was diagnosed at 25 with stage 1 melanoma. It was removed in 12 years later, it recurred in both lungs, my liver, my spleen, and right in the mesentery. When I was diagnosed, the doctor told my wife that he'd be surprised if I were here in 2 years. I had a 2-year-old daughter and a 4-week-old son, and said that wasn't acceptable. And we went on a journey to look for the best possible chance for me to get a durable response. We found a clinical trial where we did a series of immunotherapies, and I became the first patient to do this immunotherapies in this series ever. So I do a blog called Patient One, where that came from, and it didn't work. And we were able to get from that trial to a second trial on another immunotherapy, and that has worked really well. So as I've gotten better, part of what I've tried to do is get more information out there and let the population know that's going to go through this road, that there are treatments out there that can help, that are in trial, and that can save your life just like it saved mine.
And Dr. Reardon, would you just talk a little bit about your research that you're doing?
So at kind of major academic cancer centers like the one I work at in Boston, we're involved in evaluating a wide spectrum of different promising new types of treatments. Certainly a big area of focus has been immunotherapy treatments, but there are others as well. At centers like ours, our research typically starts in the laboratory and then transitions into the clinic with early clinical trials that, if successful, if promising, advance step by step as quickly as possible, but it has to be a careful process toward eventually getting the drug available. So my research is focused primarily on immunotherapy, but our center and our group has a wide range of interests similar to other academic centers like here in New York at Memorial and other places.
Great, thank you. So, Dr. Reardon, earlier you were talking about sort of how you help kind of coach your patients through selecting a clinical trial. And I'm curious to hear from the patients on the panel, what are tools that you've used in selecting a clinical trial when you have maybe a few to choose from? And what has been helpful to you from your medical team in making that decision?
I think cancerresearch.org, I believe, was where Nicole, our daughter, first started looking, and we continue to use that as well as Cancer Research Institute. When I spoke with my main oncologist in Ohio, where I live, about certain clinical trials I'd found, he indicated that those weren't available at this major cancer center. However, go for it, pretty much were his words. And so we continued to look and found that they were available in another state, and we were able to travel and use those, that now famous line of mine, vacations with needles. We used those as kind of our vacations, but also I was getting treatment. So, finding them and then finding a doctor that says, sure, travel, leave this, we'll keep in touch, but, you need to go where the trials are available.
TJ?
The first one we found simply because we were looking for the best available treatment, and it was the first, after 4 second opinions, it was the first one to present a trial to us. So part of it was finding an NCI-designated research center. Places where they are doing research tend to have, cutting-edge medicine. The second trial we found through an advocacy group. There's melanoma-specific ones, but there's advocacy groups specifically for different types of cancer, and then cancer-wide. And each of them are very tuned into what the latest research is. They can help you navigate through something like clinicaltrials.gov that is really not always easy to understand if you're overwhelmed with without an oncology background. So an advocacy organization or a cancer-specific organization is something that, or a place that you can go to find help just taking that first step and wading through the overload of information.
Yeah, so kind of going outside of what you're maybe already familiar with and reaching out to different places to see what they can offer you seems like an important piece of that. To talk a little bit about the kind of what it's like to be on a clinical trial, maybe Crystal, you can start us off with what does a kind of typical day look like for someone who's coming in to start a clinical trial?
Wait, first I forgot to say I'm a breast cancer survivor of 2 years. I don't know why I forgot to mention that. Clinical trials vary from one clinical trial to the next. So as far as what's going to be done and how many visits and what's really required of the participant. But I think some things in common is I think the first initial contact would be with the treating investigator, having a conversation about what they're recommending as far as the clinical trials, and they should be providing you with an informed consent. And that informed consent will have a series of information on it about the clinical trial, like a description, what procedures will be done, what the visit schedule will look like, how many participants will be enrolled, risks, all those things. And it depends on the cancer and stuff like that, but you should be given enough time to take it home, read over, think about questions, and then come back in and be able to sit and ask questions. And this should not be done in the waiting room. It should be in a private area where you feel comfortable, so that you can make an informed decision about it. And consenting does not mean that you are bound to it. So you're just giving consent that you want to go on the trial, and it's voluntary. The next visit that's kind of similar across the board is a screening visit. So I think Dr. Reardon was saying about, you have to be eligible. So we have inclusion-exclusion criteria that we as the research staff kind of have to go through and figure out if this is the best thing for you as far as if it's safe for you. So looking at your organ function, so making sure your kidney and livers are functioning properly. That might be done with blood tests. Looking at your heart, maybe it might be EKGs or echocardiograms. I'm sorry if I'm mentioning things and it's maybe going over, but let me know. And it might be imaging to see if you have disease that can be measured throughout the trial. So that's kind of a screening visit. Once we decide that this is, you're eligible and you would, want to enroll, the next sets of visits are really depending on the trial. But your research nurse and your treating investigator would tell you kind of when those visits would kind of play out. And with my patients, I like to give them a calendar, and it kind of lists out what's going to happen on each day. Sometimes we have a window, but it kind of gives what's kind of expected of you if you do decide to enroll and when you would come in. And type of things that might happen on those visits would be, again, blood tests. It could be research-related blood tests like pharmacokinetics. That's just seeing what the blood's kind of doing in the drug's doing in the blood. It could be safety labs, so making sure that before you're getting the drug that it's safe to give it to you. It could be questionnaires. A lot of research trials have patient-reported outcomes, so we kind of want to know what's going on with you. Those questions might be, how's your appetite on a scale of 1 to 5, and this could be on an electronic device or a questionnaire. Now, on a daily basis, depending, sometimes we have combination therapies. So if you're taking a pill at home, in addition to the immunotherapy that's given, intravenous or at the institution, you might be required to do a dosing diary. So that might be recording what you're taking each day and just writing it down, what dosage, what time maybe, if you have to do a blood pressure with it, what have you. And then I also like my patients not on a daily basis, but if you do experience side effects or anything that's out of the normal, kind of to write that down, because it is important to us to kind of, to make sure what's going on with you so that we can manage it appropriately. And I call my patients every once in a while, especially the first couple of times, to make sure everything's going okay and they kind of are aware where their next visits are.
Great, thank you. Crystal, you mentioned the importance of the initial visits with the investigating doctor. Dr. Reardon, can you talk about kind of what those initial conversations look like with a patient who's interested in a clinical trial, and what are the common concerns that you hear, common questions about?
So I think the initial conversation starts maybe a little broadly and then becomes more focused, thinking about options that are out there, looking at surgery, radiation, chemo, standard options. I usually put things into perspective of what's an established treatment, what has a proven track record, what's helped other people in this situation. And then the other category to consider are the clinical trials, the promising new things that are coming along. So some patients prefer to stick with something that's tried and true and has an established track record. So we talk about those options, we lay them out, and then talk about, in general terms, about the clinical trial options and what to consider there. Depending on the disease and the situation, the tried and true established treatments may have a pretty good track record, and for some people that might be the best way to go because the investigational agent doesn't have any kind of a record yet. It's why it's a trial. But we talk about that in general terms. I think it's very important for patients and families to feel informed about their options. I think that's a critical aspect of my job, taking good care of my patients, make sure they're doing their therapy and tolerating it well, but also my job is also to help provide information and have them be as informed as possible. So those initial conversations start off broad, but we quickly kind of narrow things down, and I certainly share my thoughts and biases on what I think might be the best option or the top options A, B, and C for them and their situation, and then why. One of the things I did want to emphasize or add a little further emphasis to that Crystal mentioned is the informed consent. Once we've come to an agreement on this is the option we're going to pursue and move forward with, if it is a clinical trial, we're obligated, we're required ethically to have your permission to move ahead with the treatment, and the way we get that is with a written document. It's usually quite lengthy, and these documents have to go through a lot of information, and we have to write them at a level where people can understand them broadly. So ours are written at a 5th grade reading level typically. That's why it takes a lot of space, and they're quite long. But we go through that packet of information carefully because that's a usually very good resource. It gives background information about why why we're studying this drug, why we're excited about it, what's involved for you, how often do you have to come in, how often you take your treatments, blood tests, scans, what are the potential benefits, what are the potential risks. That part of the consent form is usually very scary because anything and everything that's ever happened on that drug is listed on that form. And can be pretty overwhelming, but we talk about that and what are the common expected things or the uncommon atypical things. And then clinical trials all are designed to respect your confidentiality and privacy, so that's always a part of the consent form. But once you've signed that consent form, that is not a contract, as Crystal mentioned. That is simply your permission for us to proceed, get everything in place for you to start that therapy. You always have the right at any time. An hour later, you change your mind. The next day, 3 months later, whenever, you always have the right to say, I don't want to do this, I don't like it. You don't even have to give an explanation. That consent form is not binding in any way. It's not a contract. It's simply your permission for us to move forward.
Thank you. You mentioned the kind of intimidation factor of the consent form.
Yeah.
And TJ, you were the first person in your first clinical trial, right? So you were the first.
Yes, the first person to do a series of immunotherapies in this certain sequence. I kind of plugged one in the middle of another.
So what did that feel like when you were kind of on the cusp of beginning this new protocol?
It was kind of like I don't know, imagine this. You guys, it seems like most of you out here have a personal tie to this, very close. If you were young and had a young family, and the doctor told you, you or your loved one had 2 years to live, what would you do? Would you want to look for the best possible chance for a response? That was my attitude, and I think it could have been easy to be scared off by, the oncologist saying, you're the first person that's ever going to do this, and I looked at it differently. I said, all right, well, this is an opportunity. Like, you're telling me this is the best chance to see my kids graduate high school. I want to do it. Not I want to take that chance. I want to take this opportunity. I'm the first person. Great. No one's ever failed before. So, let's do it. And well, that's perception kind of becomes a bit of reality. And I think that mindset not just made me but made our whole family feel that okay. we're going to give this a shot because it's the best chance. The experts are telling us this is the best chance for me to get that response. Let's embrace it, and let's take it and go with it.
What about you, Kaylin? Did you have any reservations upon starting your first or your second or your third clinical trial?
Well, the first one's certainly the most reservation because I didn't know what to expect. If I'd had Crystal explain, I mean, she explained the whole process, as did Dr. Reardon, you know, the consent form and the fact that you could opt out at any time if you wanted to, and, you know, the monitoring and that kind of thing. I also was the first patient in a newly developed clinical trial, and that was a bit unnerving, especially when there were cameras there wanting to videotape. I'm like, no, thank you, I'll pass on that, please. But it was a bit unnerving, but also, like TJ said, you know, I had grandchildren, but I still wanted to see them grow up. And as the speaker before us talked about, I forget what it was, changing your soap or whatever, I remember thinking I'm probably never going to put salt in the salt shaker again. You know, once it's gone, it's gone. So you want to get that time and you want that opportunity, and, you know, it's just, you go for it. I think I was that kind of a person already, so I don't know how to instill that feeling in people that are afraid of trying anything new, except that this is your life. What have you got to lose but, in fact, that life? So, you know, go for it. They've done lots of research. As my daughter said when I went to the first clinical trial, I said, gee, kind of, should I be doing this? I kind of said it, you know, as an aside, and she said, I think they tested this in a Petri dish, Mom. Oh, well, then I'm good. I'm good to go. So.
Thank you. We want to open it up to questions from you all, if you have, right here.
Yeah, I guess. My question is to Dr. Reardon. Out of the several or many neuro-oncology centers in the United States, you know, that specifically deal with, let's say, multifocal anaplastic astrocytoma, which, in your professional opinion, would you recommend that would provide the most cutting-edge type of treatment along a clinical trials type of treatment, you know, for that specific issue that we're dealing with? It's actually a three-part question, but that's just my first one.
So I think you bring up a good point on a very specific topic, but one that's relevant to probably many people here. And again, Stephen made this point first and foremost this morning. When you have a diagnosis, especially if there's something that makes it a little unusual, not the most common situation, you really want to go to a center or seek out opinions from people who have significant experience and dedicated efforts to deal with that specific situation. So for the question you're specifically looking at, there are a handful of centers in the United States that really have very experienced and significant research programs, again, transitioning from the laboratory into the clinic to help people with that specific situation. So the centers in the U.S. that have those dedicated teams and that experience would be a couple in Boston, here in New York. There's a few that are excellent. A couple on the West Coast, UCSF, UCLA, the Mayo Clinic, Duke University. Those would probably be the top places.
Dana-Farber or Sloan Kettering?
Dana-Farber, Mass General in Boston, Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, Columbia, NYU, they have good programs.
Another question regarding the clinical trial. Let's say you find a clinical trial that suits your specific situation. Are you geographically bound to have to partake in that clinical trial in that specific hospital? Can that be done, you know, in your home state, in your home city, with, you know, your local oncologist? Is that something that's possible?
So that's another great point. Again, relevant to many people in here. Depending on the size of the trial, they may be limited geographically. So many of the trials that we're looking at are new promising drugs that are fairly early in development For those treatments, patients have to come to the Farber to get that treatment. There are trials of drugs that are in later stages of development, typically phase 3 trials, where there may literally be hundreds of centers around the country participating in that trial. So you may come to the Farber, and you may be from Pittsburgh, and I'll say, well, we have a trial here, but there's also this large trial, and there's a center right in Pittsburgh that's conducting the trial that you could sign up and participate in at that center. Where you sign up is where you typically have to go for the treatment, the investigational part of the treatment. We typically try to work with the local team of physicians caring for our patients, where they will help out with as much as possible. But typically, once you're signed up to the treatment, the investigational agent part of the treatment means you have to travel back and forth to that center to have the treatment.
And I guess my last question to you would be on the eligibility of clinical trials. Let's say that you're denied eligibility for various reasons. I know a lot of the reasons for eligibility aren't specifically due to medical reasons. I know pharmaceutical companies would want to pick and choose the best candidates possible for clinical trials to get their drug approved through FDA. I understand that aspect. So my question has to do with a compassionate use. And how would you go about that, or is that something that's quite common that you could request to participate in a clinical trial even though you're not eligible, but under a compassionate use type of situation? Is that something that's viable?
So that's another very important question that's applicable for many cancer patients. If you're not eligible to participate in the trial, compassionate use is a mechanism to try to pursue. There's a range of feasibility for that. Drugs that have become approved for other cancer indications that are being tested now in clinical trials, patients may be able to get those drugs if they've been approved for other indications. For example, a patient comes to me and there's not a clinical trial with an immune checkpoint inhibitor available for them in their situation. 2 of them are FDA approved now for lung cancer, melanoma, and 1 for a couple of other indications. We can apply to those companies on a compassionate use basis and the patient's insurance, which is another important aspect of it, and say, there's research in the laboratory, there are ongoing clinical trials, we think it may be able to help the situation. Will you allow this to be available for the patient, even though it's not approved for that indication? Once it's approved for a different indication, there tends to be a little more leniency about allowing that to happen. It gets much tougher for drugs that haven't been approved yet, that are still in early stages of testing, to get compassionate use availability for them. But that's something that also varies a lot depending on the drug and the company that sponsors that research. Some of the companies I work with, they have a policy, they never allow compassionate use of a product until it's passed the bar of FDA approval for a different indication, and other companies are more lenient and willing to consider that. It just depends on the drug and the company, but it's certainly something you can bring up and talk to with your cancer specialist, your oncologist who knows the field and would be able to guide you on the possibility of compassionate use if a clinical trial is not available.
Okay, right here.
Thank you. You brought up something, Dr. Reardon, about a phase 0 clinical trial. I was wondering what that is. Is that compassionate use?
No, phase 0 typically refers to drugs where, or trials where we're testing to see if the drug has an actual impact on the tumor. A phase 1 trial is a trial that's designed to evaluate the safety of a drug, what doses, what schedules are going to be best tolerated. A phase 2 is designed to see if we see evidence of success. And a stage 3 is when we look at a drug to see if it actually, when compared to the gold standard head-to-head, is better. A phase 0 is when we're not looking at any of those things, safety, efficacy, or better than the gold standard. We're looking to see if the drug gets to the tumor and does what it's expected to do. So for example, for brain cancer, this is a critical issue for us. Many drugs don't get into the brain very effectively. Phase 0 trials would allow us to, are designed to give the drug to the patient. If they're scheduled for a planned surgery, they would then undergo that surgery after taking a week, 2 weeks of the study drug, and then we would do careful studies on the tumor to see if it's actually getting in to the tumor and hitting its target, doing what do we expect it to do. If it doesn't do that, then it really doesn't need to go into the other stages of development.
Thank you.
Back here.
I have a question for people who've lived through immunotherapy regarding side effects. Because 1 year ago, my husband had stage 4 melanoma, went through a clinical trial, the immunotherapy and the steroid treatment to deal with the side effects, and still has lingering side effects. He's still not himself. So I'm always, is there research on long-term side effects and how you have actually dealt with it? What have you done? How do you deal with the side effects, or how have you dealt with them?
I've been very fortunate. I have not had side effects from the particular immunotherapy I've been involved in. And of course, I compare everything to traditional chemotherapy. I had intraperitoneal, I never can say that word, but the
Intraperitoneal.
Thank you. Chemotherapy, and 6 rounds of that, and was told after each round that I probably wouldn't be back for the next one because it was too rough, and that made me more determined. So I compare everything to that, I think. And immunotherapy, except for the fatigue, maybe the first day after, and some, localized side effects from where the shot or the injection were. So I can't answer that, I guess. I apologize.
TJ?
I can answer, not much more for it. My side effects have been relatively manageable. You kind of, when your immune system gets, for lack of a better word, boosted, and it kind of is in hyper mode, you do experience it, and it becomes, all right, is something wrong with me now? Is this just, am I just coughing because I got the cough, or is that a side effect of the drug? I've been fortunate there hasn't been very many debilitating, other than fatigue, that you learn to manage by getting rest before treatment, getting rest after treatment, but I don't have any long-term ones. I don't think that maybe helps you, but I know that there are people that have done my immunotherapies that do have some, so I would say if you and your husband are experiencing that, reach out to the melanoma community especially. Come find me afterwards, and I can introduce you to some people that probably can help.
So back here, this man in the light-colored shirt.
Yeah, it's a two-part question. The first one is the immunotherapies are rather expensive, or can be rather expensive, and are they covered by things like disability, Medicare, that kind of thing? And the second part is, in many different fields of medicine, there are open-label extension studies, either before something comes to market or they fast-track it after they come to market, where they at least have an open label with 6 months. And I'm wondering how those things are addressed for immunotherapies, period.
For the first part of your question, I'm going to give you a not very satisfying answer, but I'm going to put you off till the next session, which is all about paying for treatment. And so hopefully your question is answered then. If not, there's time at the end for that. But Dr. Reardon, do you want to discuss the second part?
So once a drug has actually gotten approval, I think this is what I'm referring to, but correct me if I'm wrong. Once a drug has got accelerated approval or has gotten approval by the FDA, there typically are required additional studies that need to be done. That actually refers to a phase 4 study where post-marketing the sponsor, the company that's making the drug, is required to monitor and follow a large cohort of patients for any additional safety information that may emerge about the drug as it's being used in a broader patient population. And there are aspects to participate in those types of trials, just like on the earlier stage trials as well. But there, you're looking at an approved drug, so you're taking a treatment that has now a proven track record because it's gotten approval, and just contributing to the overall experience and safety of it, rather than answering a question about its actual treatment benefit.
I think we have time for one more. Oh, we have some from our live stream viewers.
Yes, several of our live stream viewers have been asking about leiomyosarcoma. And one of our users is wondering what, if any, clinical trials are going on right now about that, and whether there are any significant ones upcoming.
Well, we don't have a specialist in...
But I do think Dr. Ritter mentioned before, if the person you're going to the treating physician doesn't tell you, on your end you can be looking at clinicaltrials.gov. And also for the person who was asking about the other institutions that are carrying out the actual clinical trial, clinicaltrials.gov also lists, they should be listing the institutions that are open. And it will tell you if it's open, if it's not yet open, if they're accruing to the study, if they're close to accrual. And there should be, I believe, contact information. And then as research staff, we're expected to update that information throughout the whole trial. So that is one way you can get maybe answers. And there's a search engine, so you can put in maybe your cancer diagnosis, your stage, and there's an advanced search option on there.
And TJ mentioned that clinicaltrials.gov it's really designed to help the medical community be able to look and find. So all the trials are described in typical language that the oncology community is used to understanding, and not the lay community. But I have patients who literally just print out a list from clinicaltrials.gov and come into the office and say, what about this, what about that? I found out about X and Y, and what do you think? And that's where we start.
Another good resource for that person is the CRI Clinical Trial Finder, which some of you have participated in today, but it's also accessible online. If you go to cancerresearch.org, you'll find a link to the Clinical Trial Finder on the homepage, and you can either do it online or you can do it via phone with a trained navigator. And let's do one last question. This person right here, yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking at your brochure here now. My cancer, I have anal cancer of the lung. It metastasized in my lung, and you're not showing any clinical trials. I've been on 4. I was just taken off my 4th one. The cancer grew on each clinical trial that I was on. I've called up the Anal Cancer Foundation. They're not hopeful. They're like, basically, there's nothing being done. If it weren't for Farrah Fawcett, I don't think anyone would know what anal cancer is. But I'm just curious to know how come it's not mentioned in the brochure. I'm waiting to hear this week. I'm hoping to go to I've been at Sloan Kettering for the last 2.5 years. Now I'm possibly going to be going to Johns Hopkins. I had gone down there a couple of weeks ago. They're saying they had options, but they didn't want to spell anything out for me until after this last clinical trial, which they just took me off of this week. I'm just curious to know. It's one of those rare cancers, and I guess there's not enough currently out there, so enough money isn't being put into it. So, I'm just trying to figure out, is there still hope or what?
Well, I think Dr. Walchuk made a very good point this morning when he talked about how clinical trials are evolving a lot. So there may not be an option now, but literally I've had patients where I see them one week And 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, I call them up and say, you know, I just found out we just had this open up. There's a new trial, a new option. So there is, you know, there is a lot evolving. It is an exciting time. The new immunotherapy medicines that are out there, and in particular the growing trials that are looking at these important combinations, which I think are really the future. The trials we've done so far are scratching the surface of the potential of these drugs and these treatments, and really the next generation of the combination treatments that are moving forward we're really excited about. And TJ, it sounds like you were really a pioneer with some of that effort. But so there may be others, even if there aren't any at the moment, and for less common cancers, there are less frequent trials. We just need a critical number of patients to get the trial done. But to stay in touch with the research in the field and know that options may open up in the future for you.
Okay, and that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, everyone.